Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Lorandom discussion following the release of Chapter 7 of our Generative Art Timeline. And that was covering the decade of the 1990s. I'm your host, Peter Baumann, or Monk Antony. I'm the editor-in-chief at Lorandom, and joining us today are the artists who lived art history in the 1990s, especially digital art history. And those artists are Aria Harvey, Joshua Davis, Leah, Scott Draves, and Vuk Kosic. I'm also here with two other people from the Lorandom team. So that is the Funny Guys and Conrad or Nemo Cake. So thank you to gentlemen for joining as well. A little bit more about why we're doing this talk. At Lorandom, I've been writing this generative art timeline for about a year, and Conrad has been invaluably helping with adding images, and the timeline goes back 70,000 years and kind of covers just systematic thought in general as a kind of prelude to generative art. And we've had a talk for each of the chapters that we've released so far. This is our talk for Chapter 7, the early web era that covers the 1990s. Our artists today, I will begin by introducing them. And our first person that I'll introduce is Aria Harvey. She is an artist that produces simulations and sculptures that bridge a physical and digital space, but she's also a net art and video game art pioneer who contributed to some of the first internet projects commissioned by a major institution, and that was the Guggenheim Museum. And she was the winner of the first major prize given for an online interactive work by SF MoMA. Her work can be found at institutions like the Whitney Museum of American Art and the Buffalo AKG Museum. So Aria, thank you so much for joining us today. Our next guest is Joshua Davis. He's a renowned American designer, author, and new media artist who's been using programming to create interactions with users and generate visually stunning compositions through randomized processes since 1995. He's a very early adopter of the Flash program and a pioneer of Flash art, but he's worked with many other languages, which we'll talk about. His work has been shown at the Tate Modern, PS1, MoMA, and Ars Electronica. Our next guest is Leah. She is a pioneer of software, Flash, and net art who's been producing work also since the mid-90s. Her practice spans video, performance, software, installation, sculpture, and digital applications. Her work is rooted in minimalism and conceptualism and has been exhibited at venues such as the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Venice Biennale. And then our next guest is Scott Draves. He is a pioneering software artist known for his Fuse algorithm and Electric Sheep, which was a collective intelligence consisting of hundreds of thousands of computers and people that used math and AI to create an infinite animation. But he was doing that in the 90s, the predecessor to a lot of today's AI art. So we're very happy to have Scott with us. His work has been shown at LACMA and MoMA. Our final guest that I'll introduce, certainly not least, is Vuk Kosic, a pioneer of net art and ASCII art. He's also a lecturer, writer, and curator. He's been exhibited and published internationally. And in the mid-90s, he was one of the originators and founders of net art. His work has been shown as the Slovenian representative at the Venice Biennale and at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. So again, what an incredible lineup. It's hard to believe we got you all in one place. So thank you all so much for joining us today. It's a real astonishing pleasure to have you all. So thank you very much. And I think we'll get started with a question. I've been talking way too much. Maybe we can begin with a question for Aria. Maybe you can just kind of tell us about starting with net art in the 90s, or getting started in general with working with computers. I think I've read that your parents or your mom worked with computers, and that's how you originally got started. But yeah, I'd like to know how you first kind of got started working with net art in the 90s, and if you could talk a bit about Skin on Skin on Skin, that first engagement of yours with the net and the art world. So thank you so much for joining us, Aria, and yeah, please can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, I would love to. It's difficult for me to talk about getting started with the net art, but we'll start with my involvement with computers, which indeed does come from my mother, who was a key punch operator at a certain point. So she had a knowledge of computers in its very early stages of being something that normal humans could interact with, I guess. And she very much wanted me to know about this world also, and put me in computer camp when I was a child, when I was basically like 9 or 10 years old. And that founded a love in me for programming and understanding program directions as something that creates visuals, let's say. I became a teenager and rejected all of that for a while, as was the top side, the way it was in the 80s in a way. Like, it just seemed like uncool. I had no examples of it around me, and therefore it felt like I was doing something very unusual, and I rejected it for a bit until I got to college, and then I got back in the beginning of the 90s, like 90, 91, I got back into computers again, because I was going to Parsons School of Design in New York City, and they started a computer lab, and that I got a job at the computer lab because I had some previous experience. But at any rate, I got out of school in 93, still no internet, of course. That was only in 94, 95, around 95 sometime, that I saw the internet. But I cannot talk about net art without talking about Vukozic and Leah and all the rest who were already there, or who were just starting to get online as well. We were all kind of there at the same time. And so there was a real community there already, and it was an international community, and it was the first time I really had anything of that magnitude, where you're really talking to someone in another country. This was just not normal back then, really, to do that. Everything was quite separate. I find that I have to explain this like so much. I don't know what the others feel like, but it's weird to have to explain. No, there was no talking to someone, in Austria if I was in New York City, just like that, So this was a beautiful thing, actually, and it was very impactful, not only for me, but for everyone who was online at the time, to suddenly have this ability, So I would say, to answer, or at least sort of broach upon your other question about Skin on Skin on Skin, yes, that's how I met my husband, who was in Belgium, Michael Samin, and we immediately started collaborating on that. But I had already been working on my personal website, which was entropy8.com, while I was in New York City, which was kind of my fake it till you make it site from like 95 till 99, where I was, I don't know, I'd say I was into the same stuff that Josh was into in a way, like just working, pretending I was a big graphic designer, getting clients, like working with, I was working primarily with, in that time phase, working with Virgin Records and movie companies, Virgin Records. So I was making sites for rock stars. Basically, it was hilarious because it was just me in my little East Village apartment, working with these giant corporations and stuff. But you could get away with that back then quite easily. So, so that was sort of the front facing part, was that sort of work for clients. But then in the back room where I had my real fun, I was doing the net art stuff and meeting people online like Olia Lialina and Vuk Kosic and many, many others. Leah, like, and we were just having fun on private servers. I think at least 3 of us were in hell.com. So I don't know about you, Vuk. I can't remember. But anyway, there's so much to talk about that time. And I would actually love to pass it over to Vuk to hear about his early experiences online, because I kind of I very much idolized like all the people who were involved in the very, very first wave of net dot art, which was very different from what we could have done in New York City, which we would never dream of calling that net dot art at the time, because that was just not, the net dot art was the thing that was happening on other mailing lists and different locations on the web. But I would love to hear him talk about it. So I know I'm taking it away from you, but I would just pass it over to Vuk.
Funny thing that I'm listening to Oria very carefully. I'm really grateful for the sweet word you said now. Everybody felt that there's no center. So it's kind of funky to listen to someone from New York, sitting in New York and explaining how, we were in this third world place, things were happening somewhere else. And me, I'm talking from like Slovenia of all places. And, now I'm supposed to, after hearing you, say to myself, oh yeah, we were the cool dudes. This is where it was at. But of course, this emotion, this feeling of like being at the super jet lagged periphery of everything seems to be global, and there's no centers. Otherwise, yes, what I recall, I mean, it's very similar. You sit with that machine, you feel some sort of epiphany, like, oh no, I can do these things, I can communicate to people, I can express whatever I feel. Without many filters, without any administrative personnel such as curators or gallerists, these waiters in our lives that are, and the cliche, it's wrong when a waiter tells you what you're going to eat, and that is how I always felt with curators. Like, you work for me, young man, not the other way around, and it's never going to be like that. And so fuck off, to put it mildly. And so internet gave us this. One possibly specific little thing about this mainly European band of net artists is that, yes, we were all, with mother's milk, we were given this institutional critique, and we felt like we're warriors in, against some sort of a big evil art system. All of us kids in this, let's call it band, or what were we? We all had our brushes with the system. We all disliked our experiences, and so we felt free. And so there was a lot of that. Punk was maybe an important influence privately, but the previous pop phenomenon that gave us, let's say, a seriously important lesson was the grunge movement. You might recall. These people started committing suicides like 20 minutes after becoming famous. And they became famous pretty much like on a second riff they ever played. Like, it was so fast. So this gave us some ideas how to not behave. So we were looking at like defense. So you jump on a stage and you look at people like with your like ugliest look you can give them. I think that describes our attitude. And when it comes to work, man, we were very different. Sometimes it felt a little bit like, all these crazy immigrant painters in France in the early 20th century, these Spanish immigrants, they should be expelled, obviously, in normal world, right? They all had studios next to each other, Picasso, Braque, Gris. And we felt the same, only at a large distance. So I remember Oria's early, octopus and all those things. It was really remarkable, and it's fantastic. I felt like she's my first door neighbor. I can look in, behind her shoulder, like check. Oh, you're working on this. How cool is this? So there's some of the stuff that got invented in the cloud among us. Unclear who came up with what, and I find that to be beautiful. So there you go. That's my very first little short take on what I remember.
Yeah, thank you for that response, Vuk. And maybe we can jump it over to Joshua really quick, since Aria also mentioned a bit of Josh's work. But Josh, you started early in your career with HTML and just kind of diving around the experimental internet. And a lot of these early skills that you built were very crucial to kind of the really iconic website, PrayStation, that you obviously worked on for a long time. Maybe tell us a bit more about that story and how that kind of emerged from like your early practices in the 90s.
Yeah, I think the common thread that you'll find between all of us is I really felt like we were all working in a vacuum. Like, it's not like we could walk down the street and walk into a gallery and go, oh, okay, this is how you make artwork with computers. So we were all kind of in this like empty void. And I think that's why we naturally all started to gravitate towards each other. Like, what the fuck are you doing? And what are you doing? And how are you doing this? So it was a strange time because there was no social media. There was no YouTube. There was no, I mean, it was dark. We really were making work out of nothing, out of a void. To go back, I got my first computer when I was 11. It was a Commodore 64, mostly because I was playing a lot of video games. So my dad bought me a Commodore 64, and he ends up getting me the Visual Basic programming book because he thought, well, if this guy's going to like, video games, maybe he wants to program them. So I think my first computer book was when I was 11. It was programming Visual Basic and I still have it. It's upstairs. I still have the Commodore 64. I still have the hard drive, which I think weighs like the size of a small man. It's easily like 50 pounds. I still have all that stuff, which is hilarious. I have to talk about bulletin boards because my whole route was actually kind of like the tail end of punk rock, early goth and industrial and skateboarding, and how that whole scene relates into like a fuck everyone, do it yourself sort of mentality was a big shaper in like, no one's going to help you but you. And so, you want to learn something, fucking figure it out. Stop crying. There's no resource to look up, right?
You can't just like Google what you got to program. I mean, it's insane. I don't even remember how it was done. I think you just had to try things over and over again. It's like anyway, it's forgotten, thankfully. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. But if we talk about like bulletin boards, like I couldn't afford software. And so like, I remember I went on to a bulletin board in New York called Cemetery Ridge. It's where I downloaded my first cracked version of Photoshop. And in that day, the people who would crack the software would leave like a 5-minute, fully like 3D world with planets like cracked by, and you'd like fly through this thing. And I'm like, I don't know what the fuck this is, but I want to be friends with these people. And it was always like this 5-minute like preview animation. And now, like when I think about it, when I think about the demo scene, like they were doing shit that I'm trying to do like in 2024 with GLSL. And I'm like, how the fuck did these people do it, in front of this cracked software? So that was kind of like my first like aha moment into digital work. And I remember in 1994, I go to school at Pratt, much like Aria, and I got a job there in the publications department to do Pratt's first website, which I think we launched in like 1995. And that was all HTML. And thankfully, with HTML, you could view source. So I could like look at what other people were doing, like understand like, oh, this is how you take 2 images and have them swap when, you roll over. And I remember like that was my first foray into really getting serious about this was like 1995. I had a domain on the Pratt website where I was just like working out HTML and JavaScript and Perl. Now, much to Scott's point, I was so like hungry about learning this, and I think I bought like 30 programming books, all different. Like one was C, one was C++, one was whatever. And I just ended up doing like the Hello World program and like every single book. And what I found is like, I knew how to write Hello World, like in every programming language on the planet, but like I wasn't a master of anything. And it wasn't until I saw Leah's work that she was doing on Turks and Dextro that I was like, I don't know who the fuck this is, but I want to do this for the rest of my life. And if it wasn't for Leah, I would not be on this call with you today. Anytime I get invited to do any kind of show, I somehow weasel Leah into collaborating with me. So I bring her into like oh, you're doing a museum show? do you know Leah? Like, I managed to try to pull her into everything, because if it wasn't for what she was doing in director at the time, it would have not like impacted me in such a profound way. So I'm going to move it to her, because I don't exist without Leah.
Thank you so much. I'm very, very thankful, Joshua, for bringing me into a lot of things, because it's a man's world. It's hard. Yeah, for women in this field. Anyway, I started in 1995 and I wanted to become rich, which didn't work out for decades. My boyfriend back then, he did 3D architecture models for architects, and he earned a lot of money. I was like, I want that too. So I bought my first tiny computer, and my first job was to cut out images for a CD-ROM. It was about natural healing plants or something. So I would go with my zip drive go by bus into the next district in Vienna and deliver my pictures. And I was there, I saw a guy and he did something with code and stuff was moving. And I was like, I want to do that. That's interesting. He makes code. It's like a wizard. He writes things and stuff starts moving, and it was interactive. And I was like, so I asked him if I could have a copy of the program, because I had no money at this time. So I got a copy of the program, I got the handbook, and I basically copied the Macromedia Director handbook by hand twice until I understood what a function was. It was called a handler, and the language was Lingo, and it still is, or was actually. It was one of the most powerful programs ever out there, Macromedia Director. It allowed people to really quickly do some animations by dragging and dropping without knowing how to code, and then you could enter the next level by actually writing code. So either you would fill your timeline with lots and lots of sprites, they were called, like the images and the sounds and the material you would use for making a CD-ROM, or you could be super smart and write everything in one script, and it would do the same thing, but it was smarter and nicer. And so anyway, I learned how to program myself, which has advantages and disadvantages. I think the disadvantages were that I was probably much slower in learning, and probably there are smarter ways how to do things. And the advantage was that I was so clueless that I tried things for myself. Like, as an example, I tried to build a tree. How do you build a tree? You have a trunk and then it starts branching. But if you only have like 150 channels in that Macromedia program, then you have to come up with a solution. What happens if I already have 150 branches? What do I do? So some branches would stop and some would start again, and everything would be interactive and depending on the mouse position on the screen. So if nowadays I would like to make a tree, I would probably Google it and say, okay, tree, and then I would come up with an L system or whatever boring ready-made thing, and I would never try to do it myself, basically. So advantages, disadvantages of being early. Disadvantage, there was no one to look up to, and advantage, we had to do it all ourselves, and we had to be creative, and we had to invent everything from scratch, basically. That was my first program.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, we will hopefully we can get to a few more questions later, and maybe we can move to Scott. And yeah, I'd love to maybe to hear more about Electric Sheep. I know this was at the very end of the 90s, so maybe you don't have to start there. But I just think it's such a fascinating project, and we've already kind of touched on it offline before the call. So yeah, can you tell us a bit more about Electric Sheep and how you got started with that project?
Sure. I mean, it was the first version. I mean, I wrote it in like a week in between. I had like a month in between two jobs. I think it was 1999. I was living in San Francisco. I mean, the .com boom was happening, and I think I had a month in between jobs, and I went to Burning Man for a week, and I would think I wrote the first version of Electric Sheep and the original idea was kind of, I mean, it was based on the fractal flame algorithm, which was sort of one of the pre-existing works from the early 90s, and actually goes all the way back, which was a series of experiments going back into the 80s. And I can tell you more about the Electric Sheep, but I really want to at least briefly mention and agree with like what Josh said about like the pirate software scene. That was really sort of pivotal for me for like becoming a programmer and getting into computers, getting that, the spirit of sharing, and just getting access to all the sort of tools and languages that I wouldn't have otherwise had access to. Like, I had just an Apple II at home, and like I think some of you basically taught myself a lot of bad habits, and it all worked out in the end. But like seeing those intros and sort of just having to figure stuff out on your own was really sort of pivotal for me. And just like I remember as a kid, I think spending a lot of time at home alone in the dark and essentially just trying to entertain myself. Like how can I write a program that doesn't get boring, like starting out with like spirograph, and then like random numbers and placing geometric shapes and saying like, oh, it's too slow, like what can I do to make it go faster? And so what can I do to increase the probability that something interesting happens? And so I think that stuff was really formative for the project that became the Flame algorithm, which was released as open source to refer back to the sharing thing. And then but the funny thing about the Flame algorithm was it was really slow. And part of how it worked was by solving an equation, not just like sort of by drawing primitives like lines or triangles or something like that. And so it takes like millions or billions of iterations, and so it took like an hour to render a frame on a regular PC, like like what I had. And so when I had originally created that algorithm, I actually I'll tell this story because it's a little bit crazy, but I was actually on an internship, and I had this job in Tokyo, and I had access to a supercomputer, essentially the high-end Silicon Graphics workstation. And so during this brief moment of free time, like I could, I was able to just, I'd been working on solving the equations, and I'd always made like approximations, in order to get the render time to be reasonable. But this was the first time I was able to just say, hey, like just run it and come up with the real, the real answer. And that was sort of like that supercomputer was like the telescope that allowed me to, allowed us to like sort of see the beauty in the mathematics and sort of extract, start to get the message from this information space. But it was just a summer job, so I didn't continue to be able to use the supercomputer. I had to go back to the regular PC, and so animation was pretty much impossible, or really hard to do for a very long time. But because it was open source, it got put into like After Effects and stuff like that. People started doing stuff with it, and at some point I got this like a VHS videotape in the mail. I don't even remember how they got my address, and it was of a really cool fractal flame animation that like some guy who worked at like a VFX place, like maybe like somebody like Leah's boyfriend, who had like a real job and a render farm, and they had made this cool thing, and I was like, wow, that's great. I wish I could do that, but all I've got is this crappy PC. So how could I get access? How could I do this? And I think this was when SETI at Home had like just come out a couple months ago, and so really I just put two and two together, and had the idea for that first version of Electric Sheep, and it just was a quick, I just threw it together and put it out there, and like nobody noticed. I mean, like I said, it was Linux only, and it took quite some time for sort of people to pick it up, and eventually, especially, getting some open source contributors to do things like port it to Windows, port it to Mac, and then eventually it started to take off. And with the Electric Sheep, since it's sort of participatory, the more people who are running it, the more computer power it had access to. And so that was kind of the sort of the origin story for that. And I'm not sure. I'm happy to, I'm not sure where you want me to go with it. There's different sort of questions or directions I can answer, but that's the basic outline. I think you mentioned the fuse algorithm. Also, I can tell you a little bit about that if you want, or is that a separate question?
I do. I would love to talk about the fuse algorithm. One thing, maybe a follow-up about Electric Sheep, and I know one of the artists that you really looked up to was Carl Sems, and
that's right.
Wondering about
he
this.
Had the connection machine, so
right. I'm wondering about this connection between evolutionary art and the kind of machine learning art that you were doing at the end of the 90s, and also how that relates to the AI art of today that isn't really related to Harold Cohen and that symbolic logic driven art. It's more related to this machine learning and big data art that, and I think kind of the roots of that are with Carl Sems and Latham and with your work with Electric Sheep. So I'm wondering how you see that genealogy.
Yeah, I mean, I was inspired by Carl, over and over again, and I totally agree that it was a sort of an extra step beyond what, of course, the Harold Cohen's technique, what you would call the expert system, but that was just, this was just the normal evolution of computer technology. That was the state of the art in AI when he was going. By the time the late 80s had come up, we had genetic programming and stuff like that, and with more computer power, you could go beyond. I think what Carl did and what the Flame algorithm did was, we were both using genetic algorithms and genetic programming, but there was an important, which a lot of people have used, and is actually not that different from sort of the symbolic kind of AI. They both have sort of just like tree languages inside of them. There's a machine learning component instead of like a human expert approach, but the language for the search is sort of similar, and I think this, the language, which essentially the model, is a really crucial aspect of machine learning, of course. And I had, by then I was in grad school and studying information theory, and I was like super into AI, and so this idea of like language as the and machine learning as like the approach to art was, or just like the approach to making things, a sort of like a finite language is a way to like you can say an infinite number of things, and so there's a way of sort of like crossing of crossing over there, and so that was kind of the attraction. But what I was saying is like there was something extra, which is like in Carl's work and my work, was that it's not just like the genetic symbolic part, but there was like a sort of a pixel part, and then that was what was sort of different about the Flame algorithm. It wasn't rendered with just like a couple of normal triangles. It was like a neural network. It was doing a whole lot of floating point in order to sort of solve an equation and then the image kind of emerges from all that computation. Similarly, like Carl's thing, it was like it's running the algorithm on every single pixel for his genetic images. And so the end result like had this sort of like organic living, sort of like more feeling that like was a little less human. It didn't look at all like something that like somebody would like sort of like draw or paint or whatever. It really had this kind of like alien contact feeling that that I liked. And so that kind of like I think the heavy use of floating point is also a key aspect of AI that was that brewed up at that time.
Thank you, Scott, for this amazing, fascinating background information. I think now that we have some fascinating background information about all of you, maybe we can skip to some group questions. And actually, one that I would like to ask to whoever wants to reply to it. Like, how did the communication exactly happen between all of you in the 90s? I think for someone listening in 2024, it's probably difficult to imagine, but what were the mediums, and how important were in real life meetups in this community?
Real life meetups were not necessary nor required, nor did they really happen that often. But I would say the main way, mailing lists, right? Like legendary mailing lists, 7-Eleven. Let's hear it.
Yeah.
Syndicate. That time.
Well, yeah, I did those too. But there's been other stuff. I'm really, Joshua, I'm grateful you mentioned BBSs, and for me, however old you are, there's always somebody older that was your idol, and for me, it was Tom Jennings. I don't know if you know that guy. He came up with this FidoNet, which is not super lousy, right? We all admire it, and but also the things you mentioned, like before doing all of that, as an early whatever person, he used to do a gay skaters zine in the early 80s, and I somehow still cannot remove this from my mind, because for him this was a genesis, and I really appreciate it. Anyway, this is the difference between Europe and US, I guess. In those days, we did manage to meet up relatively often. It started in the early 95, like random emails, like, hey, what's this thing you're doing? It's kind of nice, I'm interested. But there was only a few of those, and this question was asked of me earlier, but I kind of avoided it. The first meeting of this Next Time band in June 95, in this Venice creepy village fair. It was kind of funky because at the time, the Berlin club scene was very important, and the organizers of the Venice Biennial insisted that these people come over and do a presentation of that. What our German friends did was to organize a 3-day rave, which was at the moment quite something. And in the top floor of that theater in Venice, we had a 3-day conference of internet critique. And at the bar, we had Marina Abramovic selling drinks, and Josef Koschut, and those people who were Gastarbeiters in Germany at the time. Anyways, then we started meeting very often. There's been a good conference in Budapest, Hungary, of all places, called Meta Forum every year. And we would invite some American people, but not you young people of the time. But we had this cocaine cowboy, John Perry Barlow. I don't know if anybody remembers that name, who wrote that obnoxious Davos manifesto of, what was it called? Independence? Jesus, crap. And I don't know, I remember other American people, Hakim Bey, a New Yorker, Peter Lamborn Wilson, great guy. So that was our connection. But we kept meeting, and we kept doing books of our texts, and we kept sharing our websites and doing collaborative websites. And so it was kind of dense in Europe for a time. Keith Bunting, my brilliant, beautiful friend still today, he experimented with only living in festivals. So his entire totality of his luggage was a CD-ROM with his backup around his neck. And he would just move from couch to couch, from festival to festival. This was 96, 7, 8. Before he moved on to Banff, which is, where in Canada, where artists go to die. He got himself a job for 2 years. It's like, sorry, the expression, that's what we used to call it at the time, because it was like too beautiful. It's like in the middle of a national park, and pine trees and swimming pool in the morning, and a beautiful wacko European cafeteria called the La Palette, where everything was pink. It was like the most disgusting thing imaginable. Yeah, so before Banff, yeah. Anyways, communication was mailing lists, all the time, continuously. You would be on 3-4 lists, and you would know everybody alive, and you would like be really burning to see which crazy, beautiful person is going to be posting something new, and you would really genuinely think of that during the day, and then so it's hard to say if with NetTime, with NetArt itself, was our output the communication itself, where the web-based stuff or stuff inside email was just illustration of what we wanted to talk about. So the actual dialogue was more important, and the web-based stuff was just like a promo, like a demo of what I'm thinking of right now. I think that was that communication. And of course, it died quite fast because people moved into the career mode, and that's the death of community. People started giving their posts to proofreading first before posting them to NetTime. That's when we made 7-Eleven. We said, fuck this, man. So it's a bit punk.
I think for me, the first, and this will fold into obviously conversation with Leah and Aria. I know I started on IRC after bulletin boards, and then there was a follow-up to that happened a year later called ICQ, which were, so IRC and ICQ were kind of like the WhatsApp before WhatsApp, where you could, have a tray of friends and you could constantly message those people. I don't start Dreamless, I think, until 2000. So, I mean, obviously that doesn't relate till the 90s, but I think there was a need for my community of people who was predominantly using kind of Flash at the time, where Dreamless was a hidden message board where how you got in is you had to view the source. And if you viewed the source, there was the instructions on how to actually get into the community. And Dreamless, I think at the peak was about 5,000 people. And it had all the early Casey, Golan, a lot of the early NetArt people were all there. It ran for 4 or 5 years, and then eventually I shut that down. And we didn't start doing these things on Dreamless. They were called riots, where we actually started getting, so anyone who was a member of Dreamless could do a riot, and a riot would be like a local meetup in a city. So we had a section on the message board where people could organize these meetups. And the funny thing is, and I love telling the story, is the first one that we had in New York, we had the "Hello, my name is" badge. And we all ended up writing our names, and no one knew anyone. And so we had to start over and writing our handles about, oh, you're PlayStation, like, oh, you're Josh. I don't know who the fuck Josh is. So it was funny, we were all using these sort of aliases, and it wasn't until we actually put our names on aliases that we understood who everyone was. But that didn't happen in my sort of collective group of people until 2000. However, Hell comes along. So I was kind of working on 2 projects at the time. I was working on PlayStation, where I was kind of working out ideas. And then I created a character and an alias that worked on a project called Once Upon a Forest. And Once Upon a Forest got me invited into Hell. And when I joined Hell.com, Leah was already there. Aria was already there. And I would love for them to talk about Hell, because it's such a great project where everyone thought that the website was that you couldn't get in and that there was nothing more. And so everyone believed that you couldn't get in and that there was nothing more, but there was actually a private server where we were all sort of talking and showing work together. Of course, that's where I meet Michael and Aria, and I see Skin on Skin happen in real time. I watched them fall in love in real time, which was incredible.
Really? I would say to the alias thing, Leah has always been Leah, period, which I always admired that.
That's true.
Leah's always been Leah.
Yeah, it's only because my second name is not really something that Shosho knows it.
Oh, but it's great. But Leah, in my show that's up at the Museum of the Moving Image, they blew up that the screenshots you took of me the night Michael and I met, when everybody was there in the big chat and we were all on video and stuff. And I started going in the private room talking to Michael, and you took a bunch of screenshots and you sent them to me the next day. This collage of screenshots is now blown up, like gigantic on the wall. I need to send you a picture. So
Yeah, I just got to say, if you're in New York and you have not gone to the Museum of the Moving Image, like I hate to say this because she's on the call, but the fucking show is incredible. The show that has been put together at the Museum of Moving Image of, like, I want to say her life's work is really something not to be missed. So if you're in New York, please stop by the museum because it is a wonderful collection of artifacts from over 30 years. It's incredible.
I don't want to speak for Leah, but talking about like being, you know, using computers while female, you know, I think a lot of us really did want to be a bit more anonymous because it just made things easier to be able to shift in and out of your actual persona in that sense. So I had many different handles depending on what I was doing for a while, you know, but no one knew my name for a long time at all. Like, and that only happened towards the 2000 end of things, I guess. But to invite Leah in again, the one thing I got to say about that was there were sort of local scenes, or it felt like it. So like what was going on in Austria at the time was super interesting and dovetailed nicely into the 2000s because it was very audio visual. It was very like Leah's work was really beautiful. It is really beautiful, but it was really beautiful at the time because it was all these small elements leading up to this sort of big effect, you know, and you could sort of see this local style in a way. I don't know if you felt that, Leah. I've always wanted to ask you that. So many artists who were working with you at the time have just disappeared in a way.
Yeah, I think we all influenced each other in Austria, and a friend of mine, Norbert Pfaffenbichler, he organized something called Abstraction Now, like it was a show and videotapes, and so there were a group of people and in Austria who liked doing abstract work, and for me it was like I always liked abstract work. I never liked to draw real things because, first of all, I'm very bad at drawing real things. I tried to copy like 27 books of art history, and I tried to copy almost all the pictures in there, besides the cave paintings. Probably I could have done them best, but so I always liked to draw and play with, but playing with colors was my most favorite thing to do. So the abstract art was perfect for me, and playing with colors in the mid-90s was playing with a very restricted palette. Also, like that's why black and white was the first choice, because you could do things that did not look completely ugly in 256 colors. Yeah, you were asking about the scene. Yeah, we partially worked together, but we would also meet up and show each other work, and we would comment on each other's work. So that was quite a lively scene here. Also, the first question was about, yeah, the meeting in real life or meeting online. I both met like Aurea and Joshua online, and we talked online for a long time, and then years later we would meet in real life and in person, and we still like each other.
I can ask you New York people, did you guys come across the thing, Wolfgang Staele?
Of course.
Participate or belong or whatever?
Yeah, of course.
He was our man in Havana. He was like our Omaha Beach, the other way around. He was like our first stop in New York. Yeah, he was always cool, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Just checking.
So for me in Austria, also the Ars Electronica Festival, on my behalf, they invited all the artists from all over the world, and they would come to my country. No, I'm joking, of course, they did not do it on my behalf. But for me, it was really cool because I could take a train like 2 hours, and I was in Linz, and I could meet everyone there. Every year, there was this huge amount of people coming here, and yeah, it was awesome. So it was both mailing lists and real life meetings.
Leah, did you work together with Konrad Becker, those people, the public net base?
No, not really. In Vienna, there were like 3 servers. There was like the public net space, and then there was Silver server, and the third one I forgot. I think there were 3, and they were basically, ta-da! Joshua has won the Golden Nika. Yeah, he did it. I didn't do it.
I never went to Ars Electronica, actually. I did move to Europe. When I moved to Europe, the main reason I was really happy to finally move here in 1999 was because I could finally be in the same time zone as the people whose work I really admired. I really enjoyed finally going by train and meeting you and meeting Olia and meeting everybody. And because View Source was the biggest thing, you were so used to viewing people's brains, the inside of their mind in some way, and seeing how their minds worked and how their creations were made. And so meeting people in real life. And I'd say that a lot of my work is about this idea, about how you're in the digital, it's also very intimate. This intimacy that you had, this intimate knowledge that you had of other people through their ideas. And then you finally meet them in person, and it was just like, it was amazing. You felt like you all had already known each other for your whole lives in a funny way. And
we shared an adventure. We were conspiracy theorists, but our conspiracy was making a better world and not describing, the killing of Kennedy. And the passion was, I think, comparable to what we see now with the crazy people.
Are you calling us crazy or what?
Yes.
And maybe like one thing, especially like talking about like Leah's like Remove kind of project, and we talked about like this audience engagement that NetArt provided with you, kind of allowing your art to reach a kind of a global standpoint to some degree. And Leah's Remove was very amazing with it, kind of allowing the audience to really interact with the system, really interact with the parameters and kind of change things around. How did this kind of global engagement kind of influence your guys' kind of creative careers or kind of ideas behind some of the work that you created? I'd really love to learn about that.
Well, the first question we asked was, oh no, now we have a global audience. Is it going to somehow influence our topics? Are we now suddenly going to have to forget our local cultures and things we care about and start behaving like IBM commercials with like a little girl in an Indian village operating a keyboard? And well, now everybody had a different answer to this. My little group of people, all of us being very cynical and very anti-capitalist and all of that, our choice was to deliberately go for lower tech. Our choice was to deliberately go to run as fast as we can in the opposite direction from the one suggested by the makers and vendors of any type of technology, be it software, hardware, infrastructure, protocols. So our aim, as I spoke of this particular group of people, was to like get away from that. So we didn't care, I think, and that made the work function. And we kind of suggested one of the poetics that later became ubiquitous. That was a question of time also, but let's not complicate it.
I guess we did not know how many people would see our work, and that made it also like, I didn't know who my audience was, how there was no analytics or whatever. So it also, it kind of gave me freedom to do whatever I want, and I didn't have to fulfill anyone's expectations because there were none. So the biggest thing was, I think, to not have to have a gallery or someone who promotes you. You could just put it online and see what happens. That was the big freedom.
Yeah, there was definitely a vibe of trying to avoid anything that normal as a gallery or, something like this. Like we really wanted to see if we could create a different system. And I'd say that, to what Vuk is saying, like it was very eye-opening, to encounter like this so-called local cultures, the local cultures of anyone, like, outside of your own skin, like, at that time. And so suddenly to be confronted with what was going on in terms of global conflict and, all this stuff from a real personal point of view, like, because you're suddenly immersed in it, so to speak, via your connection with other people, I, for one, was obsessed with the server logs of my servers. I was hosting like my own stuff, even when I was in New York City for a while. And I was like obsessed with knowing where people were coming from and where they were going. Like, you know, you could do that back then. You could kind of just see where the IP address is, do a reverse lookup, you know, you could kind of understand this. And to me, this was really important, knowing who my audience was. I had a webcam trained on me. I was sitting at my desk, and there was a webcam on me 24 hours a day. And people would come to my website I just replaced my entire homepage by this big video stream, what we would call a video stream. It was actually like more like a pushing an animation every so many frames, because there was no video streams online. It was just a very fancy sort of GIF animation in a sense. And I could see when someone connected, because I would see it on the computer, someone's connected. And I would be able to know kind of where they were in the world. And there was an email address, and people could email me while I was sitting there working or whatever, you know. And this was amazing, actually. But I'd say the most amazing thing was when I started hooking that up to visualization. So Michael and I, when we got together and we made our web pages, we would always make sure there was a way you could see how many people were there. You know, sort of just this kind of basic data visualization. You would just see like, oh, via the way the pattern was on the page, you know, or we did an online performance every week via this engine that we hooked up with Flash and Perl scripts and all kinds of stuff. It was called Wirefire, and everybody would be visualized as a speck of dust on the screen. So you come in and it would just be, you know, and you would see there's 50 people here, you know, or whatever. I mean, it's a good segue into talking about tech a little more, maybe, because Flash was awesome. I'm just gonna say the way you could hook it up to, I mean, there was Director, which Leah talked about, which I think was instrumental in a lot of us understanding in a very easy way how to create interactive visuals. But then you got something like Flash, where you could really hook it up with web tech, with like literally with other types of web scripting and all this, and create very sophisticated things online very easily. I mean, if I could do it, then anybody could. I felt, and that was what was great about it. And I'm sorry it's dead in a way.
And even before that, there was, I think I cut my teeth on HyperCard, which was almost forgotten these days, but it was all there. And I was really happy actually to hear Vic mention Hakim Bey and John Perry Barlow. I mean, that stuff was really, in the air and influential for me. That's what like my friends were talking about. The music we were listening to was that kind of stuff. Critical Art Ensemble. I mean, I was in Pittsburgh. I knew, you know, and for me it was really a lot was more in person. You know, with Steve and Nell Tenhoff actually was a big mentor for me at that time, and just the other, you know, grad students who I learned so much from. You know, that's where I learned sort of about the cut up technique, and just sort of like the, you know, the culture of like, you know, art is life, and you know, that kind of stuff. So I wasn't so much in the mailing lists, but for me it was like an in-person thing, and I felt like like sort of like there was like in this like weird club of just a sliver of people who had like sort of a double life. Or like sort of access to some other world that you know, that we were as concerned about as real life. So it's good to hear those names and ideas again.
Yeah, the Steve Critical Art Ensemble was glorious, right? Yeah, amazing shit. But there's been all this stuff. I mean, we were all reading the histories of avant-gardes, and we were all most of us seeing ourselves as like the lone riders of this like completely new world. And you looked back, and there was all your steps in the snow, you know, blah blah blah, the cliche. But genuinely, whatever you came up with, you told someone, and it turns out it's like the first time that was ever uttered in the history of humanity. Like, and whatever you put your fingers on to try and make, it was like the first tree on the internet. It was like the first triangle on the internet. I don't know. And that's intoxicating, and it's beautiful to remember. And it's a rush. Even now that I recall some of these tiny episodes, super private episodes, it's beautiful. It's glorious. It feels good. Well, all of us are like Jimi Hendrix, who failed to overdose. We shouldn't be alive talking of these things. It's gone with our, youth and shit like that.
Thank you for the wonderful image. I mean, I agree that it's humbling to speak with all of you, and I'd love to maybe continue with questions that you have for each other, and one that it seemed like Aria asked Josh, what was a bit more about Flash. And I know, Josh, that you are known and you've used a lot more languages than just Flash, including lots more, including Java and processing. And you could tell us more about that as well. But yeah, I'd love to get your take as an early adopter of Future Splash Animator, as it was called, and also you have a quote of that maybe you can tell us a bit more about. It's that Flash was a scripting language with a vector-based environment. I like the idea that I could edit things on the fly. There were more possibilities with illustration than there were with Photoshop. So I'm wondering, Josh, if you could just maybe break that down for us and maybe explain that to us a little bit more, especially anybody who's listening without any technical background.
Yeah, so first understand that when I saw Leah and her work and knew that she was doing it in Director and Lingo, that the book for Director was like this big and the book for Flash was this big. So let's not kid anybody. I ran away from Director because the book was too large. I just felt like, oh my God, there's too much to know and I'll never be able to catch up. At the time, it was called Future Splash Animator. When I first started using it, it was not owned by Macromedia. Macromedia then, of course, buys it, and then it becomes Flash. And really, I'm going to be totally honest. The reason why I really went to Flash was that there was this moment when I realized that when I was working in HTML and JavaScript, and I'm going to watch everyone's face on this call right now because you'll all understand what I'm talking about. I swear to God, I spent half of my time on a project just sniffing whether they were on Mac, where they were on PC, where they were using Netflix, where they Netscape, where they using Internet Explorer. Like half of my code was just trying to figure out what hardware the end user was using. And so when Flash came about and it said, hey, the thing that you make is exactly what the person will see as long as they have the plugin. And I was just like, okay, cool. That's it. I'm gone. Like, goodbye, HTML and JavaScript. Hello, Flash. And
the only HTML you needed was the embed tag. That was
all you needed was the embed tag. And everyone would see exactly the thing that you intended. So there was this idea of intention that when you were working in HTML and JavaScript, and because it was the Wild West, like you just didn't quite know. Like you'd go over to a friend's house and you'd be like, wait a minute. This triangle is all the way up there and it's green. Like that's not what I intended it to look like. And so I go to Flash like super quick because I realized like the intention that I had, the thing that I could make, I knew that they were going to see it as long as they had the plugin, and the plugin was actually, growing and growing at an exponential rate that we kind of knew that it was going to take off. It was vector-based. So you asked this question about, raster versus vector. And this is your Photoshop versus Illustrator. So it's like, if I make a square in Photoshop, it's made up of pixels. And if I make it in Illustrator, it's actually points that describe that square. So I always loved working in the vector-based environment because it didn't matter if it was a CD-ROM or a billboard, it could be printed at any size. And I remember having this conversation super early on with Leah I was like, how are you making work like for these album covers? Like, because we were all working at like 640 by 480, mind you, like that was the resolution, 640 by 480. And here Leah was making these like amazing like album covers. And I think she told me like one time, either online or when we met up, that she was making her work like super huge. And I think maybe you were tiling it so that she could assemble the tiles in Photoshop, and then when she would shrink it down to the album size, it would gain in resolution so that it could be printed, right? So these were all problems that we had. With Vector, it didn't matter. Like, it could be printed at any size. And it also meant that, and Scott had mentioned this too, when you look at my early work, it's static because I couldn't animate it, because what I was doing is I was writing all these programs in Flash. I was actually passing them through PostScript, and PostScript would generate this .ps file that I could open up in Illustrator. And in Illustrator, I love showing this slide when I give talks. My Flash programs that I was writing passing through PostScript were 144,000 layers in Illustrator. So they could not be animated. And that's why you don't see me start to animate things until like, you know, maybe 15 or years later, where I was able to actually animate some of the stuff that I was generating. So I always liked Vector because obviously when it's raster, it's flattened, and it was very hard to edit anything inside of Photoshop. Where these Flash files, because I was drawing with vectors and then painting them back to PostScript to vectors, it meant that if I didn't like something, I could just select that individual thing and just delete it or change the color. So there was this way that I could edit things that was just a lot easier. And the funny thing is, I spent 15, 20 years in Flash. I worked at a studio called IO360, and my designer was Casey Reese. And I was like one of three, we were called design technologists. And Casey then later says like, oh, I think I want to learn how to program. And we were like, oh, okay, cool, Casey, like you go do that. And he's like, yeah, I'm going to take continuing education classes at NYU. And we're like, awesome. And then like a month later, he's like, yeah, I think I'm going to go to MIT. And we were like, what the fuck is going on? And it's funny because I've known Casey for a long time. And of course he creates processing, and now like it just comes full circle. Like, you know, I'm mostly using processing in a day-to-day. So it's just such a really beautiful, weird circle that occurred.
And now we do P5JS. we're back to the web.
Yeah.
Guys, my answer to vectors or raster was ASCII. Like, don't go where the capitalism is going. Like, don't go there. And I'm not criticizing your choice, young man. I'm just trying to reply.
No.
Well, I'm right now, I'm redoing actually my old remove works to put them online again, and I'm using P5JS, and I had to write something that would, because Director was pixel based, so I have to write something now that puts things by, put something onto a pixel and not in between, and not make it anti-aliased or something like that. So in Director, if I would draw a line from one point to the other, it would be really, really pixelated. And so I had to find something which is called Brazenham's line algorithm that actually I can use to make lines pixelated again, just so that I get the same feel and look from the mid-90s again. It works for most of the stuff I'm doing right now, but with some shapes I have problems. But yeah, I'm working on it. Yeah, about the output. Yeah, I remember I wrote I went through the Adobe PDF description, which was super long, and I wrote my own Adobe PDF files. I did an output from Director, which would write a PostScript file, so that I could then open with Adobe as a PDF. I was quite proud of that back then. It did lines and pixels mostly. Yeah. And then, of course, in 2013, Casey was asking me if I would like to do some processing piece for the online exhibition of the processing website. And I was like, yeah, sure. And then half a year later, I was like, oh, now I have to learn how to write in processing. So I had to learn like this direct translation basically from Lingo to processing. And yeah, in the meantime, I'm using different languages, of course, also. Yeah, I think 2008 or 9, I went to Open Frameworks Lab at the Ars Electronica. They were kind enough to have me there, and that's where I learned how to program a little bit in C++. I'm still not a very good programmer. I guess I learned a little bit over the last decades. So
it's like me with GLSL right now. Like anytime I look at GLSL and I'm like, what in the God's name is this? It's like,
yeah,
it's like the most crazy, crazy language I think I've ever looked at. And it's so funny. It's like, you think you know what you're doing, you know, it's like, okay, 30 years of programming. And then, yeah, now I look at GLSL and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing.
I find it interesting that the different programming languages, for me, it's a different way of thinking with many languages. So like the shader programming, I did some things, but it's like, it's cracking my brain every time I try it again. And I forget it again and again and again. So it's just, I figured it's just not my way of thinking.
And it's funny how like node-based programming, you know, has really changed. People who maybe don't want to learn how to program, you know, it's like you look at, and I kind of wish maybe we had those tools early on, like the touch designers and the notches. It's really in the VVVVs. It's amazing how those tools have really matured to allow people to kind of navigate in the work that we were having to do, you know, completely by hand, which is absurd.
That Max program goes back to, you know, ERCOM in the 80s. So it's really been it's been around. I don't know who was doing it back then, but it's definitely an old idea and still a good one. So people love that, and I think it's great for, you know, getting stuff up and messing around. But you know, at least personally, for like, you know, building like, you know, engineering or a large complicated project at some point, all the wires drive me crazy. I get lost and frustrated, and always return to just the text. Still a good one, in a terminal. So it's really, I think, and Vuk would agree, I'm sure, that you can do everything within a grid of characters, so everything can be expressed with like the simplest thing.
I have an architect friend who is a cynical bastard, a little bit like me, and he claims that he can recognize by walking down the street, he can tell which house was done in AutoCAD 3 and which one in AutoCAD 4. That is a trap. I think it's more like a joke, but that's a type of trap I'm trying to avoid. Like I call it a consumer electronics trap.
Well, Leah is right there. You know, the language, you know, affects us. And just like the tools affect us, and it leaves its mark in the work.
Yeah, and then how you actually embrace it, and do you try to fight it, or you try to exaggerate it, and why not, as a matter of fact, and like call it a plus, not a minus, whatever it is.
I just want to really recap something that for me, I think has really resonated with me for this entire discussion, that in my mind kind of encapsulates our crew in the 90s. And you guys can obviously chirp in or disagree or agree. But I think the thing that I think stands out the most about something that Leah mentioned was that for me personally, I was a skateboarder. You know, I did not go to school for computer science. I had to sort of like self-teach myself programming, and that was a blessing and a curse. I think it took me a lot longer to like learn how to program, but because I didn't know what the rules were, we ended up like breaking a lot of the rules. And so I think one thing that I would say kind of resonates from this decade of navigating this space is that it really was working in a vacuum and a void, and it was sort of trying this work and sort of yelling it into the nothingness, hoping that people enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. But it was a struggle because there was no reference, there was no YouTube, there was no look up to see how something was done. And I think in a lot of ways that was really beautiful, because we did a lot of things that I think helped kind of forge our community, and also it just meant that we weren't doing things by the rules. It was very it felt like the Wild West. And it's interesting because if you look at today, and obviously we didn't talk about NFTs because it doesn't relate, but it's amazing how it feels very cyclical. It feels like a lot of the stuff that has happened in the NFT space harks back to like a lot of the stuff that we were trying and experimenting with back in the early 90s. And yeah, that's it for me. I think I'm really grateful for the time that we've all had today, and that's my take on this wild, weird vacuum of a time and space.
Thank you, Josh. What an incredible conversation we had, and thank you all so much for the time. I think, Josh, it's really interesting what you said about the working in a void. It reminds me of what a lot of the 80s pioneers that we've talked to also said, and maybe you remember that too, Conrad. And what's so interesting about the 90s is that you had these kind of disparate nodes, but then the internet came and brought everybody together, and I think that's one of the big takeaways from this decade, and then the Wild West then just got transplanted online, and that's where we're still at today. So thank you. What an incredible panel and discussion. I mean, I really could go on forever, but I have to, we have to respect everybody else's time. But just thank you all so much. We couldn't be more grateful and thankful. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope we can do it again soon.
For me, it was good. Thanks a lot. I haven't seen some of these faces for quite a while, so this is cool. And yeah, there'll be some other occasion sometime, I hope. Let's meet sometime physically, drink beer or not, whatever.
Thanks for having me as well.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you, everybody. It's really an understatement that it's an honor to kind of have this group together. Feels like a bunch of lifelong friends kind of getting together to chat, and we get to kind of be at this fireside, kind of fly on the wall situation. But thank you for everyone for the anecdotal stories and kind of dialogue that was able to be kind of brought up throughout this entire time. Thank you all again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye.